And somebody want to share with some conversations at your table? Okay.
So we all heard different things about what you were asking here, and in the end, we ultimately came down to, if this happens in the middle of service, like what are the things that we can do in order to lean into that moment for that person, because we have to recognize the Spirit moves at different moments, and we have very little flexibility in our liturgy. And our history as Lutherans, like this is the way it's always been done. What do you mean you move to the confession and service to a different spot? And then the intentionality. We know, as Stephanie said, there's an intentionality of starting with confession. We move from law into gospel, but then also it's what we've always done. Do we realize the intentionality behind that? And so we talked about, can we ultimately do something similar to an altar call? What would that look like in a Lutheran context? Not a decision theology-based altar call, but a moment of grace where you recognize that you feel convicted to move differently in your spiritual relationship with God, and that you realize God is calling you into that. And so how do we commit into that? We talked about lighting candles to signify relighting our spiritual relationship with God, etc. So then it's just the bigger question of how dare we consider being so un-Lutheran as to do something like an altar call?
Great thinking. That just reminded me, I had a professor in seminary who was pastor of a very, very large church before he became a professor at the seminary, and a well-known church. And he said when he was a pastor and he was leaving his study every Sunday to go out and preach, his final prayer was always, "Dear God, please do something that's not in the bulletin today."
Maria and I were just talking, and when did we get so afraid to break the rules? I can't understand that. In both of these scenarios, as we were talking, it begins with relationship. And us asking people, what do they think? What do they need? What are they hoping for? So that it's a conversation. It's not us answering the asked question as much as it's engaging in a dialogue. And I think no matter what people answer, they're looking for love, unconditional. They're looking for healing. They're looking for a sense of belonging. And that may take all kinds of different forms or shapes or different language from their part. But I mean, if somebody came up to me in the midst of the worship service, would I pause something? Absolutely. Would I interrupt our liturgy? Absolutely. The liturgy is to open our hearts to the moving of the Spirit, and God forbid that I kill the moving of the Spirit just to keep the liturgy going. But, would it be possible to have a baptism in the middle of an ongoing worship service? Damn straight, I can't think of a better sermon. Yeah. And so I think we've got to be able to look for the need before we can do anything else. And we want to make it so hard that there's some sort of right way or wrong way. But if there's a relationship with this person, we're going to respond to that. And God's going to bless that. Will there be upset people? Yeah, but there will be upset people anyway. Yeah.
Out of my experience, is it possible to put a baptism right in the middle of the service? Yes. I did that intentionally one time several years ago. And again, anytime I mention numbers, it's just my point of reference, it's just the whole thing. But I taught on baptism, preached on baptism, and extended, if you have not been baptized, but you feel that God is inviting you today into baptism, I'm going to ask you to get up and move. And it's when all of my baptisms were done then by immersion. Now I'll do either style. But But I'm going to invite you now to move, and to, if you are affirming you're following of Jesus, and we baptized 299 people that day in the middle of services. And somebody said, "Why don't you just say 300?" I said, "Because I want to get real numbers, not pastor numbers." But I think sometimes we miss those moments when the Spirit's moving, and am I in trouble yet? Okay.
You'll get there.
I was working with a small Lutheran church that found a small Presbyterian church and started worshiping together. And one of the things that the Presbyterians taught us was not only did, during a part of the service, did they talk about their prayer requests, mostly for healing, but they also talked about their blessings. And I think that's a piece where people can say, "I'm feeling blessed today because I feel God's incredible love," or "I feel blessed today because we're singing this hymn that has meant so much to me." Whatever it is, it's more that, we talk about liturgy as being the work of the people, and I found that during those free times when people were just expressing where they were, that was truly the work of the people.
One thing also you added, and actually we just started that out there in Kärkkäinen, was have an opportunity for somebody to pray with them. Because people come to church for all kinds of reasons, and if they haven't been there for years, there's something that got them there. And just to have an opportunity for somebody to pray with them, I think is very helpful.
Okay, a couple more and then we'll keep going.
So, something we talked about is that there is an opportunity in a full-on liturgical service to experience the presence of Jesus during communion. And that might get us into the question of, well, let's see, this person there's somebody sitting in this pew who would respond to an invitation to say, "Come experience the presence of Jesus." But in your scenario, okay, they're not baptized. They don't have any theology. They don't know if they believe in the real presence, the spiritual presence, consubstantiation, transubstantiation. They don't know if they believe any of that. But there's this opportunity for them to physically experience the presence of Jesus in a way that may be powerful and transformational in their life. Are you going to enforce if you are not baptized and taken our first communion class, you can't come forward? I think that opens up that question.
Great question.
Just to follow up on that, we had a conversation about, well, if they're not baptized at baptism, but also communion, and that experience of grace and the gifts that we have with the blessing of an open communion. I think a beautiful strength of our theology is all are welcome. But then we talked about making that really clear, because in a way everybody says all are welcome, but how do we articulate that we really mean that? And also we talked about other access points of how people can get involved. Is there a food distribution? Are there Bible studies? The announcements done well can be an invitation to growth and discipleship. And so there's all these different ways and all these different things that we already do that can be such wonderful invitations into a growing relationship with Christ.
Those things can be mentioned in the sermon too.
Don, one more.
The last two interims that I served, interesting, the one I have right now, I came into the congregation in 2 Lutheran churches, and they baptized or they communed at any age. I had the experience of being able to commune a 3-month-old infant who had just been there to be baptized. That was thrilling. And I've had the experience of seeing the spiritual growth of a 4-year-old who really gets it, much better than any of us who think, but who really gets it, that this is the body of Jesus. And it's a thing of absolutely marvelous, in which I believe, having had communion all of her life and not having to sit in the pew when mom and dad goes or fold their hands or whatever and get a blessing, pat on the head, that I've been a part of the congregation, been part of the adults. Gosh, that's gonna make a difference when you get to confirmation. Or I get to be 35 and struggling with the issue of death. Wow. That's just been a part of who I am, period.
Yeah, it's so many of the things that you all just said in that conversation reminded me of a statement I read a while back that said, teaching an unbeliever the small catechism is like building a second story on an empty lot. When you kind of think about what that visual picture of that. I want to give you a couple of examples from my own preaching. I don't know if it's right, if it's wrong, if it maybe it's an idea, maybe it's not an idea, but again, to begin to think and to have some conversation with that. And it may not be perfect, but it's one way that I do this pretty intentionally. The Sunday before Thanksgiving, my sermon, I titled my sermon, Jesus on Thankfulness. And it was a sermon out of Luke 18 where the sinner and the publican and the sinner they're at prayer at the temple, and that that whole story about that. I introduced, just to give you, because of what I'm about to say, I introduced to talking about Thanksgiving, it's coming, and the tryptophan that's in the turkey, and how people always blame getting sleepy on the turkey. It has nothing to do with the tryptophan, and it's just the fact that we eat way too much. Because actually, do you know this spinach has more tryptophan in it than turkey does? But I've never heard anybody say, "Oh, I'm so sleepy, I ate so much spinach," kind of thing. And so it's not the tryptophan, it's the overeating. So I go through this and the two scenarios and what thankfulness really looks like, and then here was the conclusion to my sermon. The good news I have for you this Thanksgiving week is that you can eat all the turkey you want and it's not going to make you sleepy. The great news I have for you is this. You don't have to beat your chest, beg God for atonement, or work to try to get God to love you. All you need is to humbly trust the grace of God for you, to believe. And then I said, would you pray with me? And as we went into prayer, and here was the prayer I led. Would you tell God right now that you do believe? That you trust what God's already done for you in Jesus, because you could never do enough on your own? Would you thank God for His love and forgiveness? Actually, there it is. Would you thank God for His love and forgiveness of your sins? Would you ask God to help you live the rest of your life confident of God's grace and forgiveness as you follow Jesus? And then, let me give you another example. On Christmas Eve, I was preaching out of one of the most stimulating texts in all of the Bible, Matthew 1:1-16. The genealogy of Jesus. It's fascinating, just, with all the names. And the title of my message was All Belong Here. And I talked about how many messed up people there are in that list, and yet they all belong in the story. And here's the conclusion to my sermon. There's an ancient proverb that says, God writes straight with crooked lines. Matthew knows that the lines God writes with run straight through the crooked lines that lead us to this point in the story in Matthew 1:16. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. Regardless of how crooked the lines of your life are, by God's grace, God writes straight and includes you in the story too, because we all belong here. No exceptions, no exclusions. You are cherished, loved, and included by God through the death and the resurrection of His Son. And then I invited them to pray with me again. And here was the prayer on Christmas Eve. Veli-Matti was in the service. Would you take a moment right now just to tell God, thank you for including me in the story. Thank you that the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus was for me. This Christmas, help me to live fully into that belief so I can celebrate the birth like I've never done before. Now, my purpose in having those kinds of prayers at the conclusion of the sermons, and particularly like on the Christmas Eve, was to invite people to see themselves as part of God's story, to receive that forgiveness of God that God's freely giving, and to join others in being committed to living out that story of following Jesus. And so an opportunity to respond to this grace of God, this new life that God gives them in Jesus. And so I put those couple of examples up if you want me to go back to the other one. But let's all just talk together. Let me do this. Take a couple, what time are we having lunch and when's the break? And
lunch will be ready at noon.
Lunch will be ready at noon. Okay, we're going to do this. We'll take here's what I want to do. Let's do this. Let's take a break. While you're breaking, talk with each other about kind of what having that kind of a prayer at the end of your sermon does to you. What's your kind of visceral response to that? Like it, don't like it, think it fits, doesn't fit our theology, all of those kinds. So have some conversations. We're going to take 10 minutes and then we'll be back. Okay?
Let's stretch.